Hi, I'm Jane. They say blood is thicker than water, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes blood can poison everything it touches. My own family thought they could lock me out of my own house on Christmas Eve, leave me standing in the snow like some unwanted caroler. They figured I'd just take it, like I always had. After all, I was the pushover sister, the one who never fought back, the one who'd rather sleep in her car than cause a scene. But here's the thing about pushing someone too far. Eventually, they stop bending and start breaking. And when I broke, I didn't just fall apart. I took action. By New Year's Eve, they weren't just locked out of Christmas dinner. They were locked out of everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where it all started. December was always supposed to be magical in Riverside, Ohio. Our little town transformed into something out of a holiday movie, with twinkling lights strung across Main Street and the old courthouse decorated like a gingerbread house. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, coating everything in that perfect white blanket that made even the rundown gas station look picturesque. I should have been excited. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year back when we were kids and Mom would let us open one present on Christmas Eve while Dad tried to untangle the lights for the tree. But that was before Dad died 5 years ago, before everything changed, before the house on Maple Street became less of a home and more of a battlefield where I was always losing ground. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending Christmas Eve morning in my cramped studio apartment across town, staring at a box of ornaments I'd never bothered to unpack. This place wasn't supposed to be permanent. It was just supposed to be temporary, a place to crash while I sorted things out with Sarah and the family. That was 8 months ago. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Sarah's name flashed across the screen, and for a split second, my heart did that stupid, hopeful thing it always did when she called. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe she was calling to invite me over early, to help with the cooking like we used to do. Jane, hey. Her voice was distracted, like she was multitasking. I could hear Tyler, her 5-year-old son, shrieking in the background, and Tom shouting something about the TV remote. So dinner's at 6 tonight, right? You're still coming? Of course I'm coming, I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. It's Christmas Eve. I wouldn't miss it. Right, well, just wanted to make sure you were bringing the dessert. Mom specifically asked for your apple pie. You know how she gets when things aren't exactly how she expects them. I did. No, Mom had very specific ideas about how Christmas should go. And those ideas rarely included acknowledging that I was the one who'd been making that apple pie from Dad's recipe for the past 3 years. The same recipe that came from the house, that technically belonged to me now, though you'd never know it from how they acted. Already made, I said, glancing at the pie cooling on my tiny counter. Anything else you need me to bring? Nah, Tom picked up wine, and Mike's bringing some of those fancy cheeses he likes. Oh, and Jane? Her tone shifted slightly, getting that edge it always got when she was about to say something she didn't want to deal with pushback on. Maybe don't mention the whole apartment thing tonight. Mom's been stressed enough with the holidays. The whole apartment thing. As if my living situation was some embarrassing family secret, instead of the direct result of them making it clear I wasn't welcome in the house that Dad left to me. The house where Sarah, Tom, Tyler, and Mike had all been living for the past 1.5 years, rent-free, while I paid for a studio apartment I could barely afford on my teacher's salary. Sure, I said, because arguing with Sarah on Christmas Eve felt like kicking a puppy. I'll see you at 6. Perfect. Love you, sis. She hung up before I could say it back. I set the phone down and stared at my reflection in the black screen. 32 years old, and I was still letting my family treat me like the inconvenient middle child who should just be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. Dad used to say I had the biggest heart in the family, but sometimes I wondered if having a big heart was just another way of saying I was too weak to stand up for myself. The snow was coming down heavier when I pulled into the driveway of 1247 Maple Street at 5:45. The house looked like something out of a Christmas card, with the warm yellow light spilling from the windows and the wreath Sarah had hung on the front door. It was the same wreath Mom and I had made together the year before Dad died, back when we still did things together, back when I still lived here. I sat in my car for a moment, engine running, watching my breath fog up the windshield. Through the living room window, I could see them all gathered around the tree. Sarah was curled up on the couch with Tyler on her lap, both of them laughing at something Tom was saying. Mike was standing by the fireplace, beer in hand, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. Mom was in her usual spot in Dad's old recliner, the one she'd claimed the day after the funeral and never gave up. They looked like a complete family, perfect and whole without me. I grabbed the pie from the passenger seat and made my way to the front door, my boots crunching through the snow that Sarah hadn't bothered to shovel from the walkway. I'd been doing that for years before I moved out, making sure the path was clear for Mom's bad knees and Tyler's little legs. Apparently, that was another responsibility that had just disappeared when I did. The door was locked. I stood there, for a moment, pie in one hand, keys in the other, staring at the brass deadbolt like it might suddenly spring open on its own. I'd been letting myself into this house for 32 years. Even after I moved out, even during our worst fights, the door had never been locked against me. I knocked, a polite little tap that felt ridiculous. This was my house. The deed sitting in my filing cabinet back at the apartment proved it. But something in my stomach twisted as I heard footsteps approaching the door. Tom opened it, and his face went through a series of expressions that would have been funny if they weren't so telling. Surprise, then annoyance, then something that looked almost like guilt before settling into his usual barely tolerant smile. "Jane? Hey, we were just wondering when you'd get here." I said 6. "It's 6. I held up the pie. "Can I come in? It's freezing out here." Tom glanced over his shoulder, and I heard Sarah's voice from the living room, sharp and quick. "Who is it?" "It's Jane," Tom called back. A pause. Then, "Oh, right." Tom turned back to me, and that fake smile was working overtime now. "Actually, Jane, this is kind of awkward timing. We're in the middle of Tyler's present opening, and you know how kids are. He's all wound up, and Sarah thought it might be better if we kept things small tonight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Family only. Family only." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for Sarah to appear behind him and tell him to stop being ridiculous. But the seconds ticked by, and all I heard was Tyler's laughter from the living room and the soft murmur of voices that didn't include mine. "I am family," I said quietly. Tom's face flushed red. Whether from embarrassment or cold, I couldn't tell. "Of course you are. That's not what I meant. It's just that tonight is complicated, and maybe it would be better if you came by tomorrow for Christmas dinner instead. We'll have more time to catch up then." "Tom," my voice came out steadier than I felt. "This is my house." He blinked, like he'd forgotten that inconvenient little detail. "Right, I know, but Sarah's been planning this evening for weeks, and Tyler's already started with his presents, and it would just be really disruptive to change everything now." Behind him, I could see into the living room. Sarah was watching us from the couch, her face carefully blank. Mike had moved closer, to the doorway, arms crossed over his chest like he was preparing for a confrontation. Mom was still in Dad's chair, but she'd turned it slightly away from the door, like she couldn't bear to look at me. And there, under the tree that Dad and I had picked out together from Morrison's tree farm every year since I was 7, were piles of presents. Presents that had been wrapped and placed and planned around the idea that I wouldn't be there to see them opened. "You planned Christmas without me," I said, and it wasn't a question. Tom opened his mouth, probably to lie, but Sarah saved him the trouble by appearing at his shoulder. Jane, you're being dramatic. We just thought it would be nice to have a quiet evening with Tyler, and then we can all get together tomorrow when things are less hectic. Less hectic? I repeated. On Christmas Day, when everyone in town is trying to juggle multiple family dinners and crying kids and travel schedules. It's just one night, Sarah said, and there was an edge of irritation in her voice now, like I was being unreasonable. Tyler's only 5 once, and Tom's parents are coming tomorrow, and Mom's been overwhelmed with all the planning. I looked past them to Mom, who was still determinedly not looking at me. Mom, you want me to leave? Finally, she turned. Her face was tired, worn down in a way that had become familiar over the past few years. But there was something else. There, too, something that looked almost like relief. It might be for the best, honey. Just for tonight. The pie slipped from my hands and landed in the snow with a soft thud, the ceramic dish cracking against the concrete step. We all stared at it for a moment, the perfect golden crust now dusted with white flakes, the careful lattice work I'd spent an hour perfecting broken and ruined. Jane, Sarah started, but I was already backing away. Keep the house warm, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. Wouldn't want anyone to get cold. I turned and walked back to my car, my boots sliding slightly on the snow-covered driveway. Behind me, I heard the front door close with a soft click, and then the deadbolt sliding into place with a finality that echoed in my chest. I sat in my car for a long time, engine off, watching the frost build up on the inside of the windshows while the house glowed warm and inviting just 20 feet away. At one point, Tyler's face appeared in the living room window, his small hand pressed against the glass as he looked out at my car. I waved, and he waved back before Sarah's hands appeared on his shoulders, gently pulling him away from the window. By the time I finally started the car and backed out of the driveway, it was past 7, and the snow was falling so hard that I could barely see the street signs. I drove slowly through the quiet neighborhoods of Riverside, past houses where other families were gathered around their own trees, their own traditions, their own carefully curated versions of Christmas magic. I didn't go back to my apartment right away. Instead, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of Miller's Diner, the only place in town that stayed open on Christmas Eve. The neon sign flickered red and green in the falling snow, and through the fogged-up windows, I could see a handful of other people who apparently had nowhere else to be tonight. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and Dolores, the owner, looked up from behind the counter with a smile that faltered when she saw my face. Honey, what are you doing here on Christmas Eve? Shouldn't you be with your family? I slid into a booth by the window and stared out at the snow-covered parking lot. That's a really good question, Dolores. She brought me coffee without asking, the kind of strong, bitter brew that could wake the dead. Family trouble? I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. You could say that. Dolores had known our family since I was a kid. She'd served us countless Sunday breakfasts after church, had given me free pie on my 16th birthday when I was too upset about some boy to eat dinner at home. She'd been at Dad's funeral, standing in the back of the church with flowers still dusting her apron because she'd closed the diner to be there. Your dad wouldn't have stood for this, she said quietly, refilling my cup. He always said family should lift each other up, not tear each other down. Dad's not here anymore, I said, and the words tasted like ash in my mouth. No, but his house is still standing, still has his name on the deed. I looked up at her sharply. How did you know about the deed? Dolores smiled sadly. Honey, this is Riverside. Everyone knows everything. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I stayed at the diner until almost 11, nursing coffee and picking at a piece of coconut cream pie while Dolores bustled around, cleaning tables and humming Christmas carols under her breath. When I finally made it back to my apartment, The building was quiet except for the sound of someone's television playing a Christmas movie through thin walls. I sat on my couch, still in my coat, staring at the box of ornaments I'd never unpacked. Inside that box was 32 years of Christmas memories. Handmade decorations from elementary school, ornaments Dad and I had picked out together on our annual shopping trips, the angel he'd lifted me up to place on top of the tree every year, until I was tall enough to reach it myself. Sarah had put a different angel on top of the tree tonight. I'd seen it through the window, something new and shiny that didn't have any history attached to it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. It was late, probably too late to call, but something in my chest was burning too hot to wait until morning. Morrison Legal Services, this is the answering service. This is Jane Morrison. I need to speak with Robert Morrison. It's urgent. Ma'am, it's Christmas Eve. Tell him it's about his goddaughter and it's about the Maple Street property. He'll want to take this call. I was put on hold for less than 2 minutes before Uncle Robert's familiar voice came through the speaker. Janie, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Uncle Robert wasn't actually my uncle, but he'd been Dad's best friend since college and the closest thing to family I had outside of the people who'd just locked me out of my own home. He was also the lawyer who'd handled Dad's estate and the one who'd made sure the house ended up in my name when Mom tried to contest the will. Uncle Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. What's going on? I took a deep breath. If I wanted to file a foreclosure notice on the Maple Street house, what would I need to do? There was a long pause. Janie, you can't foreclose on your own house. But I could evict the people living in it, couldn't I? Even if they're family? Another pause, longer this time. Legally, yes. If they don't have a lease and they're not paying rent, they're essentially squatters. But Janie, these are your mother and siblings we're talking about. Are you sure you want to go down this road? I thought about the locked door, about Tyler's face in the window, about the careful way they'd planned Christmas without me. I thought about 8 months of sleeping in a studio apartment while my family lived rent-free in the house my father had meant for me to have. I'm sure, I said. How soon can we file the papers? The courts are closed until the 27th, but I can have everything ready to file first thing that morning. Janie, once we do this, there's no taking it back. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? I looked around my tiny apartment, at the box of Christmas ornaments that would never be unpacked, at the life I'd been living in the margins while my family took up all the space that used to be mine. Yes, I said. I'm certain. We talked for another 20 minutes, going over details and timelines and the legal realities of what I was about to do. By the time I hung up, it was past midnight, officially Christmas morning, and I was no longer the same person who'd knocked on that door with a homemade pie and hope in my heart. I was someone with a plan. The next morning, Christmas Day, my phone started ringing at 8 a.m. Sarah's name flashed across the screen, then disappeared as the call went to voicemail. Then Mike called. Then Mom. Then Sarah again. I let them all go to voicemail and made myself breakfast instead. Scrambled eggs and toast eaten at my tiny kitchen table while I listened to the messages pile up. Jane, it's Sarah. Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Why don't you come over for dinner today? We're eating at 2. Jane, it's Mike. Sarah told me what happened last night. That was messed up, and I'm sorry. Come over today, okay? We'll work it out. Jane, this is your mother. I don't know what's gotten into you ignoring our calls like this. It's Christmas, for heaven's sake. Call me back. Jane, it's Sarah again. Seriously, you're being ridiculous. It's Christmas. And Tyler keeps asking where Aunt Jane is. Just come over. I deleted each message without listening to the end and turned my phone to silent. I had other things to do today. The first stop was the storage unit I'd been renting since I moved out, the one where I'd been keeping all of Dad's important, papers and the family documents that Mom said were too cluttered to keep at the house. I pulled out the heavy filing box and spent an hour going through everything, organizing documents into neat piles on the concrete floor. Bank statements, showing that I'd been paying the property taxes and homeowner's insurance for the past 2 years. Utility bills that had been in my name since Dad died. Maintenance receipts for the new roof I'd paid for last spring and the furnace repair from last winter. A paper trail that clearly showed who was really responsible for keeping that house standing. The second stop was the courthouse, where I made copies of the deed and the probate paperwork just in case. The building was empty except for security, echoing and cold in a way that felt appropriate for what I was planning. The third stop was Walmart, which was surprisingly busy for Christmas Day. I bought a small digital camera, the kind with a date stamp, and drove back to Maple Street. I parked across the street and took pictures. The house with 3 cars in the driveway, none of them mine. The house with lights on in every window, warm and occupied. The house with a wreath on the door and presents visible through the living room window. The house where my family was celebrating Christmas without me, again. When I was done, I drove to the other side of town and took pictures of my studio apartment. The single window with no decorations, the kitchen table set for one, the stack of bills on the counter, including the rent notice that was already overdue because I'd spent my Christmas money on that broken pie. Evidence, documentation. The paper trail that would show exactly who was living where and who was paying for what. My phone was buzzing constantly now, calls and texts that I continued to ignore. But around 4 o'clock, there was a knock on my apartment door that I couldn't ignore. I looked through the peephole and saw Mike standing in the hallway, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Jane, what the hell? We've been calling you all day." "I know, I've been busy." He looked past me into the apartment, taking in the bare walls and the cramped space and the general sadness of someone trying to make a life out of leftovers. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're living like a college student while we're all crammed into that house together. It doesn't make sense." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. So come home, come back to the house. We'll figure out some kind of arrangement." I studied his face, looking for sincerity, and finding only the same uncomfortable obligation that had characterized most of our interactions since Dad died. Mike wasn't here because he missed me, or because he thought what they'd done was wrong. He was here because someone, probably Mom, had sent him to smooth things over and get their convenient doormat back in position. "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. He shifted his weight, clearly hoping I wouldn't ask for specifics. "I don't know, we'd have to talk about it. Maybe you could take the basement room and we could all chip in for groceries and utilities." The basement room. The windowless, barely finished space where Dad used to store his tools and where the water heater leaked every winter. He was offering me the basement room in my own house. "And rent?" I asked. "Would you all chip in for that too?" "Jane, come on, you don't need rent money. You've got your teacher salary, and it's not like you have a lot of expenses." I looked at him for a long moment. This brother who'd been living rent-free in my house for over a year, who'd never once asked if I needed help with the bills or the upkeep or the property taxes that kept his roof over his head. "You're right," I said. "I don't need rent money." Relief flashed across his face. "Great, so you'll come back?" "No," I said. "I don't need rent money because I'm going to need you all to move out." The relief died. "What?" "I'm filing eviction papers. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live." Mike stared at me like I'd just told him I was planning to burn the house down. "You can't be serious. Jane, this is our family home." "No," I said calmly. "It's my home. Dad left it to me, not to the family. Me. And I've decided I want to live in it." "You can't just kick us out. Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't know, Mike. Figure it out. You're all adults." His face was turning red now, the way it used to when we were kids and he wasn't getting his way. This is insane. You're having some kind of breakdown. Am I? Or am I finally having a backbone? He opened his mouth to argue, but I closed the door in his face and turned the deadbolt. I heard him stand there for a few minutes, probably trying to decide if he should knock again or call for backup. Eventually, his footsteps retreated down the hallway. I made myself dinner and watched a Christmas movie on Netflix, something cheerful and predictable where families worked through their problems with heartfelt conversations and group hugs. It felt like science fiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mike told us what you said. This isn't funny anymore, Jane. Call me." I turned off the phone and went to bed early, falling asleep to the sound of my upstairs neighbor's television and the distant hum of holiday traffic. Tomorrow, the courts would be open. Tomorrow, I would stop being the family pushover and start being the homeowner I'd been on paper for 2 years. Tomorrow, they would learn that locking me out had been the biggest mistake they'd ever made. December 27th arrived gray and bitter, with the kind of wind that cut through winter coats and made everyone walk a little faster. I was up before dawn, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the manila folder Uncle Robert had dropped off the night before. Inside were papers that would change everything. Documents that transformed me from the family doormat into something else entirely. The eviction notice lay on top, crisp and official, with language that was polite but unmistakable. 30 days to vacate the premises. Failure to comply would result in legal action and forcible removal. At the bottom, my signature looked strange and foreign, like it belonged to someone braver than I'd ever been. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing my best black slacks and the navy blazer I wore to parent-teacher conferences when I needed to project authority. Looking in the mirror, I practiced the expression I would need, something calm and professional that wouldn't betray the fact that my hands had been shaking since I woke up. The courthouse opened at 8 sharp, and I was there at 7:45, standing in the lobby with my folder tucked under my arm like armor. Other people filtered in around me, lawyers in expensive suits, clerks with coffee-stained files, ordinary citizens dealing with ordinary legal problems. None of them knew that the quiet woman by the window was about to blow up her entire family. Uncle Robert met me at the filing window, his face grave but supportive. He'd argued with me one more time the night before, trying to convince me there might be another way. But I'd been firm. This wasn't about revenge, I'd told him. This was about finally standing up for myself. The clerk behind the window was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain. She processed our paperwork with efficient sympathy, stamping documents and filing copies with the practiced ease of someone who'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. "Service of process will be handled by the sheriff's department," she explained, sliding a receipt across the counter. "They'll deliver the notices within 72 hours. "Thank you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Uncle Robert walked me to the parking garage, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "You know there's no going back from this, right? Once those papers are served, this becomes a legal matter. Family dinners are going to be complicated for a while." I thought about Christmas Eve, about standing in the snow while my family celebrated inside the house that belonged to me. "Family dinners have been complicated for a while, Uncle Robert. I'm just making it official." He squeezed my shoulder in a gesture that reminded me painfully of Dad. "Your father would be proud of you, Janie. He always said you had more steel in your backbone than anyone gave you credit for." Driving home from the courthouse, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The radio was playing soft rock classics, something about taking it easy and not letting the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy. I turned it off and drove in silence through the familiar streets of Riverside, past the houses where I'd grown, up, past the high school where I now taught sophomore English, past all the landmarks of a life that was about to change completely. My phone had been buzzing intermittently all morning, calls and texts from Sarah and Mike that I continued to ignore. They probably thought I was bluffing, that I'd cool down and come crawling back with apologies and another homemade pie. They didn't understand that the woman who'd made that pie had died on Christmas Eve, standing in the snow outside her own front door. Instead of going back to my apartment, I drove to the Riverside Public Library, a brick building that had been my sanctuary since childhood. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, looked up from her computer with a smile that immediately shifted to concern when she saw my face. "Jane, honey, how was your Christmas? You look tired." "It was educational," I said, settling at one of the computer terminals in the back corner. "Mrs. Patterson, do you still have those databases for property records and legal research?" Her eyebrows raised slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. Are you working on something for school?" "Something like that." For the next 3 hours, I dug into every piece of public information I could find about 1247 Maple Street. Property tax records going back 10 years, showing exactly when Dad had stopped being able to keep up with the payments and when I'd quietly started covering them. Building permits for the new roof and the electrical work I'd paid for. Insurance claims that had been filed in my name because I was the one dealing with the aftermath of the storm damage last spring. I printed everything, building a paper trail. That would be impossible to argue with. Then I moved on to the harder research, the kind that made my stomach twist with guilt, even as I knew it was necessary. Sarah's social media was a goldmine of evidence I'd been too polite to notice before. Photos from expensive restaurants with Tom, tagged with locations and dates. Shopping trips to Columbus with bags from stores I couldn't afford, even with my teacher's discount. A weekend getaway to Chicago last month that she'd posted about extensively, complete with pictures from a hotel that cost more per night than I spent on groceries in a week. All of this while living rent-free in my house and claiming she couldn't afford to chip in for utilities. Mike's Instagram was less helpful, but equally revealing. Pictures of the new motorcycle he'd bought in November, parked in what used to be Dad's spot in the garage. Photos from the poker nights he hosted in the basement, surrounded by friends who probably had no idea they were gambling in someone else's house. A selfie from last week where he was wearing a watch that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. I screenshot everything, building a digital portfolio of evidence that showed exactly how my family had been living while I struggled to make ends meet in a studio apartment across town. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also useful. When this went to court, and I was increasingly certain it would, I'd have proof that financial hardship wasn't the issue here. By the time I left the library, the afternoon was fading into that gray winter twilight that made everything look tired. I stopped by the grocery store and bought ingredients for dinner, something I'd been looking forward to since moving out. The simple pleasure of cooking for myself, of making exactly what I wanted without worrying about who might complain or what dietary restrictions I was supposed to accommodate. My apartment felt different when I got home. Smaller, but also more mine. I put on music, something I'd never been able to do at the house because Tom always complained it was too loud or Mike wanted to watch television. I cooked pasta with garlic and olive oil, the smell filling my tiny kitchen and making the space feel more like home than it ever had before. While I ate, I organized the papers I'd printed at the library, creating neat file folders labeled with dates and categories. Evidence, I wrote on one folder in my careful teacher handwriting. Financial records on another, social media documentation on a third. It felt surreal, building a legal case against the people who'd raised me, but also oddly satisfying. For the first time in years, I was taking action instead of just accepting whatever they decided to do to me. My phone rang just as I was finishing dinner, and this time it wasn't Sarah or Mike. It was Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment, watching her name flash and disappear as the call went to voicemail. Then it started ringing again immediately. And again. On the fourth call, I finally answered. "Hi, Mom. Jane Elizabeth Morrison, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Her voice was sharp with anger and something else. Something that might have been fear. She only used my full name when she was truly furious. And I hadn't heard that tone since I was 16 and came home 2 hours past curfew. "I'm eating dinner," I said mildly. "How was your Christmas?" "Don't you smart-mouth me, young lady. Mike told me what you said to him yesterday, and I want you to know that this nonsense stops right now." I took a bite of pasta and chewed slowly, letting her anger wash over me without responding. It was a trick I'd learned in my classroom, how silence could be more powerful than arguing. "Jane, are you listening to me?" "I'm listening, Mom. I just don't have anything to say." "You most certainly do have something to say. You have an apology to make and some very hurtful things to take back. This family has been nothing but supportive of you, and this is how you repay us?" I almost laughed. Supportive. That was certainly one way to describe locking me out on Christmas Eve. "Mom, do you know how much I've spent on the house in the past 2 years?" "That house is your responsibility, Jane. Your father left it to you, which means you have to take care of it." "You're right. It is my responsibility, and part of that responsibility is deciding who gets to live in it." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted from anger to the kind of disappointed hurt she'd perfected over the years. "I can't believe you would threaten to throw your own mother out on the street. After everything I've done for you, after raising you and loving you and supporting you through every mistake you've ever made." The guilt hit like a physical blow, settling in my chest with familiar weight. This was how it always went. I'd stand up for myself, and she'd remind me of everything I owed her, every way I'd failed to be grateful enough for the privilege of being her daughter. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, I had papers filed at the courthouse and evidence organized in neat folders, and the memory of standing in the snow while my family celebrated without me. What mistakes, Mom? What exactly have I done that was so terrible? Well, you moved out without talking to anyone about it, for starters. You left us all scrambling to figure out bills and responsibilities that you'd been handling. Bills that I was paying for a house that I own. And then you disappeared for months, barely calling, barely visiting, acting like we'd done something wrong when all we did was try to give you some space to work through whatever phase you were going through. Phase? This whole independence thing, Jane. This idea that you need to live on your own and prove something. It's childish. I set down my fork and stared at the wall, feeling something cold and clear settle in my chest. Mom, when you locked me out on Christmas Eve, what exactly did you think was going to happen? We didn't lock you out, Jane. We asked you to come back the next day because it wasn't a good time. It was Christmas Eve. I brought a pie that I made from Dad's recipe. I drove through a snowstorm to be with my family, and you turned me away. You're being dramatic. Am I? Or am I finally being honest? There was another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, less certain. Jane, you can't seriously be thinking about making us move out. Where would we go? Tyler's in school here, and Tom just started his new job. And I can't afford rent somewhere else on my Social Security. And there it was, the real issue. Not that they'd hurt me or that they'd taken me for granted or that they'd planned Christmas around my absence. The real issue was that their free ride was coming to an end. You'll figure it out, Mom. You're all adults. Jane, please. Can't we just talk about this? Come over tomorrow and we'll sit down like a family and work something out. I thought about the digital camera sitting on my kitchen counter, loaded, with pictures of their cars in my driveway and their lives in my house. I thought about the eviction papers that would be served within the next few days, the legal process that was already in motion and couldn't be stopped with a family meeting, and some crocodile tears. There's nothing to work out, Mom. I've made my decision. Your father would be ashamed of you. The words hit like a slap, exactly as they were meant to. For a moment, I was 8 years old again, standing in the kitchen while she told me how disappointed Dad would be that I'd gotten a B instead of an A on my report card. how he'd expect better from me, how I was letting him down. But I wasn't 8 anymore, and I'd spent enough time at the courthouse today to remember exactly what Dad had wanted for me. Dad left me the house, Mom. Not you, not Sarah, not Mike. Me. If he'd wanted it to be a family house, he would have set it up that way. But he didn't. He gave it to me, and that means I get to decide what happens with it. I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone completely. My hands were shaking again, but this time it felt different. Not fear, but adrenaline. The rush of finally standing up for myself. I spent the evening organizing my files and making lists of everything I needed to do. Call the utility companies and have the services transferred back to my name at the house. Change the locks. Document the condition of the property before they moved out so I could assess any damage later. Practical things, administrative things, the kind of details that would turn this emotional mess into a manageable legal process. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a car pull into the parking lot outside my apartment. Then footsteps on the stairs, quick and angry. Then pounding on my door. That was definitely not a polite knock. "Jane, open this door right now." Sarah's voice furious and shrill. I sat on my couch and didn't move. "I know you're in there, Jane. Your car's in the parking lot. Open the damn door." More pounding, loud enough that I worried about my neighbors. Then Mike's voice joined hers. "Jane, come on. We need to talk about this." I turned up the music slightly and stayed where I was. They could pound all they wanted. I had learned something important today. I didn't owe them my time or my attention or my emotional energy. I didn't owe them anything. The pounding continued for another few minutes, punctuated by increasingly creative threats and guilt trips shouted through the door. Finally, I heard Sarah's voice, lower but still audible. "Fine. If that's how you want to play this, Jane, we'll play it your way. But don't come crying to us when you realize what you've thrown away." Footsteps retreated down the stairs, and car doors slammed in the parking lot. I watched from my window as they drove away, taillights disappearing into the darkness. I made myself a cup of tea and sat back down with my files, double-checking everything one more time. Tomorrow, the sheriff would serve the eviction papers. Tomorrow, this would become real and official and irreversible. Tomorrow, I would stop being the family doormat and start being the homeowner I should have been all along. The next morning brought the kind of crisp, bright cold that made everything look sharp and clean. I woke up early and made coffee, then sat by my window watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold above the rooftops of Riverside. My phone was still turned off, sitting silent on the kitchen counter like a deactivated bomb. I knew what would happen when I turned it on. Dozens of missed calls and text messages, increasingly desperate attempts to reach me before the papers were served. But I wasn't ready for that chaos yet. I wanted a few more hours of peace before the storm really began. Instead, I got dressed and drove to the hardware store, where I bought a new set of locks for the house. Heavy-duty deadbolts that would send a clear message about who was in charge now. The clerk, an older man with paint-stained fingers, loaded everything into a bag and wished me luck with my project. "Changing locks can be tricky," he said. "You might want to call a locksmith." "I think I can handle it," I told him, and meant it. From there, I went to the bank, where I closed the joint checking account I'd shared with Mom for emergencies. The account that had somehow become her personal ATM, with withdrawals I'd stopped questioning because it was easier than fighting about every $20. The bank manager, a woman I'd known since high school, processed the paperwork with professional discretion, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. In a town like Riverside, everyone would know about this within a week. The Morrison family drama would be coffee shop gossip and beauty salon speculation until something more interesting came along. I didn't care anymore. Let them talk. My last stop was the post office, where I rented a P.O. box and filled out change of address forms, Everything official would come to me now, not to the house where my family could intercept it. I was taking control of my own life, one administrative detail at a time. When I finally turned my phone back on, it immediately started buzzing with notifications. 43 missed calls, 67 text messages, 3 voicemails that were probably too angry to listen to. But there was one message that caught my attention, from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Morrison, this is Deputy Johnson with the Sheriff's Department. We attempted service of process at 1247 Maple Street this morning, but were unable to locate the respondents. Please call us back to arrange alternative service. I called the number back immediately. Deputy Johnson, this is Jane Morrison. I got your message about the service of process. Ms. Morrison, yes. We went to the address this morning around 9 a.m., but no one answered the door. There were cars in the driveway, but no response to repeated knocking. Do you have alternative contact information for the respondents? I thought about Sarah and Mike and Mom, probably huddled inside the house with the curtains drawn, pretending not to be home like children hiding from homework. It was pathetic and somehow perfectly fitting. They're definitely there, I said. They're just avoiding service. What are my options? We can try again tomorrow, or we can post the notice on the door if they continue to avoid service. State. Law allows for posting if personal service can't be accomplished after reasonable attempts. Post it on the door, I said. I want this to be official. Will do, ma'am. We'll try personal service one more time tomorrow morning, and if there's no response, we'll post the notice. Perfect. By this time tomorrow, there would be an official eviction notice taped to the front door of 1247 Maple Street for all the neighbors to see. In a town like Riverside, that would be almost as effective as taking out an ad in the local paper. I spent the rest of the day at my apartment, organizing and planning and trying to ignore the constant buzzing of my phone. Around 3 o'clock, there was another knock on my door, but this time it was gentle and hesitant. I looked through the peephole and saw Mrs. Chen from next door, holding a covered dish and looking concerned. Jane, I brought you some soup. You've seemed stressed lately. I opened the door and accepted the soup gratefully. Mrs. Chen was in her 70s, a retired teacher who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother since I'd moved in. She never asked intrusive questions, but she had a way of knowing when someone needed kindness. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That's very thoughtful. Family troubles? She asked gently. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Family can be the hardest thing in the world, she said. We love them, but sometimes love isn't enough to fix what's broken. After she left, I sat with her soup and thought about that. Love isn't enough to fix what's broken. It was a simple truth that I'd been avoiding for years, hoping that if I just tried harder or gave more or asked for less, somehow things would get better. But love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just dependency dressed up in prettier clothes. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to Maple Street, parking across the street from the house just as I had on Christmas Day. But this time, I wasn't hiding or taking pictures for evidence. This time, I was saying goodbye. The house looked exactly the same as it had my entire life. White siding that Dad had painted every few years, green shutters that Mom had insisted on because they matched the trim on the garage, the big oak tree, in the front yard where Sarah and I had built a tree house when we were kids. I sat in my car and remembered birthday parties in that backyard, Christmas mornings around the tree in the living room, summer evenings when we'd all pile onto the front porch with ice cream and watch the neighborhood kids play in the street. Those memories were real, and they'd always be part of me. But they belonged to a different family, a different version of us that had died along with Dad. The people living in that house now weren't the same people who'd created those memories, and I wasn't the same person who'd participated in them. I was someone new now, someone who filed eviction papers and changed locks and refused to answer phone calls from people who'd locked her out on Christmas Eve. As I sat there, the front door opened and Tyler came running out into the yard, chasing something I couldn't see in the fading light. He was wearing the Batman pajamas I'd given him for his birthday last year, the ones that were getting too small, but that he refused to give up. Sarah appeared in the doorway, calling for him to come back inside before he caught cold. She looked tired and worried, older than her 35 years. For a moment, I felt a stab of guilt so sharp it made me gasp. But then I remembered Christmas Eve. I remembered the locked door and the careful way they'd planned the evening without me. I remembered 8 months of living in a studio apartment while they enjoyed the house that belonged to me. I started my car and drove away without looking back. Tomorrow, the eviction notice would be posted. Tomorrow, they would have to face the reality of what they'd done and what it was going to cost them. Tomorrow, I would stop being their victim and start being their landlord. The transformation was almost complete. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand until I fumbled for it in the darkness. Deputy Johnson's voice was crisp and professional, cutting through my sleep-fogged brain like cold water. "Ms. Morrison, this is Deputy Johnson. We've successfully posted the notice at 1247 Maple Street. The respondent still refused to answer. The door? So we've attached the eviction papers to the front entrance as legally required." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "It's done?" "Yes, ma'am. They have 30 days from today to vacate the premises, or you can proceed with a forcible detainer action through the courts." 30 days. The number felt both enormous and impossibly small. 30 days for my family to find somewhere else, to live, to pack up the life they'd built in my house, to face the reality that their free ride was over. "Thank you, Deputy Johnson." "You're welcome, ma'am. Have a good day." I hung up and lay back against my pillows, staring at the ceiling as the morning light crept around the edges of my curtains. It was done. There was no taking it back now. No pretending this was just a family squabble that could be smoothed over with apologies and forced smiles. The state of Ohio was now officially involved in my family drama. My phone started ringing again before I'd even gotten out of bed. Sarah's name flashed across the screen, and I could practically feel the fury radiating through the device. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message while I made coffee. "Jane, what the hell is wrong with you? There's a sheriff's notice taped to our front door like we're some kind of criminals. The whole neighborhood can see it. Mrs. Patterson from across the street already came over asking if everything was okay. You're humiliating us, and for what? Because you're mad about Christmas? Grow up, Jane. Call me back right now." I deleted the message and turned off my phone. I didn't want to deal with their anger today. Didn't want to listen to them twist this into something I was doing to them instead of something they had done to themselves. Today, I had other plans. The first stop was the locksmith, a small shop, downtown that smelled like metal polish and machine oil. The owner, a man named Pete who'd gone to high school with Dad, greeted me with a smile that faded when he saw the grim expression on my face. "Jane Morrison, right? You need some locks changed?" "That's right. The whole house. Front door, back door, side entrance, garage." He whistled low. "That's a big job. You having security problems?" "You could say that." Pete didn't push for details, which I appreciated. In a town like Riverside, people learned early that sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions. He scheduled me for that afternoon, promising to have everything changed by evening. "You'll want to? Be there when I do it," he said. "Make sure you're comfortable with the new locks. Test everything out." "I'll be there." My next stop was the bank, where I met with the loan officer about refinancing the mortgage. The house was nearly paid off thanks to the payments I'd been making for the past 2 years, but I wanted to explore my options. If this turned into a legal battle, I might need cash for attorney fees. Jennifer Walsh, the loan officer, was another Riverside High graduate, someone I'd known peripherally for years. She pulled up my account on her computer and raised her eyebrows at what she saw. "Jane, your credit is excellent, and you've got significant equity in the property. Are you looking to do some renovations?" "Something like that," I said. What would be the maximum I could borrow against the house? She ran some calculations, fingers flying over her keyboard. Based on the current value and your income, you could easily qualify for a line of credit up to $60,000. The rate would be prime plus 1%, and you'd only pay interest on what you actually use. $60,000. More than enough to weather whatever storm was coming. I filled out the paperwork and left the bank with a sense of security I hadn't felt in months. Whatever happened next, I'd be able to handle it financially. The morning flew by in a blur of errands and preparations. I stopped by the grocery store to stock up on supplies, bought cleaning products and basic tools at the hardware store, even treated myself to lunch at Miller's Diner. Dolores served me meatloaf and mashed potatoes with a side of friendly conversation, carefully not mentioning the rumors that were probably already circulating about the Morrison family drama. Around 2 o'clock, I drove to Maple Street for the first time since Christmas Eve. The eviction notice was impossible to miss. A bright, white rectangle taped prominently to the front door. Even from the street, I could read the bold letters across the top. Notice to quit and deliver possession. Several neighbors were out in their yards, making no attempt to hide their curiosity. Mrs. Patterson waved from her porch, probably dying, to know what was happening but too polite to ask directly. Mr. Hendricks, the retired postal worker from 2 houses down, was taking an unusually long time to check his mailbox. I parked in the driveway behind Mike's motorcycle and Sarah's SUV, feeling strange about using my own driveway for the first time in 8 months. The house key felt foreign in my hand as I approached the front door, and for a moment I hesitated. This was still my family inside, still the people who'd raised me and loved me, however imperfectly. But then I thought about Christmas Eve, about standing in the snow while they celebrated without me, and my resolve hardened. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I remembered it, but somehow smaller. The living room where we'd gathered for countless family occasions, the kitchen where Mom had taught me to make Dad's apple pie, the hallway lined with school photos and family portraits spanning 3 decades. It felt like walking through a museum of my own childhood. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the familiar space. "Anyone home?" Footsteps thundered down the stairs, and Sarah appeared at the top of the staircase like an avenging angel. Her hair was uncombed, her face flushed with anger, and she was still wearing pajamas at 2 in the afternoon. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," I said calmly. "Or I will, once you move out." She came down the stairs 2 at a time, stopping just close enough to invade my personal space. "You can't just waltz in here like you own the place." "I do own the place, Sarah. That's kind of the whole point. This is insane, Jane. You're having some kind of breakdown, and you're taking it out on your family." I looked around the living room, taking in the changes they'd made since I moved out. New curtains that I hadn't chosen, furniture rearranged in ways that Dad never would have approved of, family photos that had been edited to minimize my presence. It was still recognizably the house I'd grown up in, but it had been transformed into something that was theirs, not mine. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "Mom's at her book club, and Tom took Tyler to the park. Mike's upstairs hiding because he can't deal with confrontation." "And you're here because?" "Because someone needs to talk sense into you before you destroy this family completely." I walked past her into the kitchen, running my hand along the countertop where I'd spent countless hours doing homework and helping with dinner preparation. The refrigerator was covered with Tyler's artwork and Sarah's work schedule and a grocery list in Mom's careful handwriting. Normal family life, happening in my house without me. "Sarah, when you locked me out on Christmas Eve, what exactly did you think was going to happen?" "We didn't lock you out. We just asked you to come back later." "You locked the door, Sarah. You physically prevented me from entering my own house on Christmas Eve." "It was one night, Jane. One night when we wanted to have a quiet family celebration with Tyler. Without me." You'd been acting weird for months, barely talking to us, never coming around unless someone was sick or needed money. We figured you wanted space. I turned to face her, studying this sister who'd once been my closest friend and was now a stranger wearing Sarah's face. You figured I wanted space, so you gave me space by taking my house? It's not like you were using it. You moved out, remember? You chose to live in that depressing little apartment instead of here with us. I moved out because you made it clear I wasn't welcome here anymore. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time anyone asked my opinion about anything that happened in this house? When was the last time anyone considered what I might want, or need, or feel? Sarah's face flushed deeper. Everything isn't about you, Jane. Sometimes, families have to make decisions based on what's best for everyone, not just what makes you feel included. And locking me out on Christmas Eve was what was best for everyone? You're twisting everything around. We were trying to have a nice holiday with Tyler, and you showed up all hurt and dramatic because we didn't plan everything around your schedule. I stared at her, amazed by her ability to rewrite history even as it was happening. In Sarah's version of events, I was the selfish one, the dramatic one, the one who'd caused all of this by having the audacity to expect to be included in my own family's Christmas celebration. Sarah, do you remember when we were kids and Dad used to make us apologize to each other after fights? What does that have to do with anything? He used to say that a real apology has 3 parts. You acknowledge what you did wrong, you take responsibility for how it affected the other person, and you commit to doing better. Do you think you could do that now? Her laugh was sharp and bitter. You want me to apologize? For what? For living in this house that you abandoned? For trying to keep this family together while you sulked in your apartment? For giving Tyler a stable home environment? For locking me out on Christmas Eve? I'm not apologizing for protecting my family. I am your family, Sarah. Are you? Because families don't threaten to throw each other out on the street. Families don't serve eviction papers like we're strangers. Families don't humiliate each other in front of the whole neighborhood. The front door opened before I could respond, and Mom's voice drifted in from the hallway. Sarah? Whose car is that in the driveway? It looks like Jane's, but that can't be right because she wouldn't dare show her face here after the stunt she pulled. Mom appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped short when she saw me standing there. She was wearing her book club outfit, a navy dress with pearl earrings, looking every inch the respectable widow she'd worked so hard to become after Dad died. What is she doing here? Mom asked Sarah, as if I weren't standing right in front of her. I came to check on my house, I said. Make sure everything's in good condition before the locksmith gets here. Locksmith? Mom's voice went up an octave. You're changing the locks? Of course I'm changing the locks. I can't have people living here who don't have permission to be here. Permission? Mom's face was turning the same shade of red as Sarah's. Permission to live in my own home? This isn't your home, Mom. This is my home. Dad left it to me, remember? Your father never intended for you to throw your family out on the street. My father also never intended for me to be locked out on Christmas Eve. Mom crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture I remembered from childhood arguments that I was destined to lose. You're being ridiculous, Jane. This whole thing is ridiculous. You can't seriously expect us to pack up our lives and move out because you're having a temper tantrum. It's not a temper tantrum, Mom. It's a legal eviction. There's a difference. Legal eviction, she repeated, like the words tasted bad in her mouth. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're doing to this family? I understand exactly what I'm doing. I'm taking back control of my own life. Your life? What about Tyler's life? What about his school and his friends and his stability? There it was, the guilt card I'd been expecting. Tyler, the innocent 5-year-old who was being hurt by my selfishness. The child who deserved better than an aunt who would disrupt his life over a petty family squabble. Tyler will be fine, I said. Kids are resilient. He'll make new friends. He shouldn't have to, Sarah snapped. This is his home. This is where he's lived since he was 3 years old. And whose fault is that? Who decided to raise a child in someone else's house without bothering to secure their own housing situation? We're family, Jane. We shouldn't have to secure anything. Family is supposed to take care of each other. You're right, I said. Family is supposed to take care of each other. So where were you when I was struggling to pay rent on my apartment while covering the mortgage and taxes on this place? Where were you when I was eating ramen noodles for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries after paying for your utilities? You never said anything about struggling, Mom said. If you needed help, you should have asked. I shouldn't have had to ask, Mom. You should have offered. You should have noticed that I was working 2 jobs and living in a studio apartment while you lived rent-free in my house. We didn't know you were working 2 jobs, Sarah said, because you never asked. None of you ever asked how I was doing or what I needed or whether I was okay. You just assumed I was fine because I never complained. You never complain about anything, Jane. You just bottle everything up and then explode like this. Like, what? Like finally standing up for myself? Like refusing to be taken advantage of anymore? The sound of a truck pulling into the driveway interrupted our argument. Through the kitchen window, I could see Pete, the locksmith, unloading his equipment. That's the locksmith, I said. You might want to gather anything essential before he starts working. Once those locks are changed, you won't be able to get back in. Mom's face went pale. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Jane, please, Sarah said, and for the first time since I'd arrived, there was genuine fear in her voice. Please don't do this. We can work something out. We can pay rent, or we can help with the bills, or we can figure out some kind of arrangement. You've had 8 months to figure out an arrangement, Sarah. 8 months to acknowledge that this situation wasn't fair or sustainable. Instead, you locked me out on Christmas Eve. That was a mistake, Mom said quickly. We made a mistake, and we're sorry. Can't we just move past this? I looked at these 2 women who'd shaped my entire life, who'd taught me how to love and how to hurt, how to give and how to lose myself in the process. They were sorry now, when the consequences were staring them in the face. They were ready to negotiate now, when they had no other choice. But where had this willingness to compromise been on Christmas Eve? Where had it been during the 8 months I'd been living in exile while they enjoyed my house? Where had it been during all the years I'd quietly sacrificed my own needs for theirs without getting so much as a thank you in return? No, I said, quietly. We can't move past this. Some things can't be fixed with apologies and good intentions. Pete knocked on the front door, and I went to let him in, leaving Mom and Sarah standing in the kitchen with their mouths open and their explanations dying in their throats. You ready to get started? Pete asked, setting down his toolbox. I'm ready, I said, and meant it. The locksmith worked methodically through the house while my family hovered like angry ghosts, alternately pleading with me and threatening legal action. Mike finally emerged from his room upstairs, looking hungover and defensive, adding his voice to the chorus of protests. But I'd stopped listening. I was busy taking inventory of my house, making mental notes of repairs that needed to be done and changes I wanted to make once it was truly mine again. The peeling paint in the dining room that I could finally address. The squeaky floorboard in the hallway that Dad had always meant to fix. The bathroom upstairs that could use updating. For the first time in years, I was making plans for my future, instead of just surviving my present. By the time Pete finished with the locks, the sun was setting and my family had retreated to various corners of the house to sulk and scheme. He handed me a set of shiny new keys, each one representing a door that would now only open for me. All done, he said. You've got good solid locks now. Nobody's getting in without your permission. Thank you, Pete. I appreciate you fitting me in on such short notice. No problem. You take care now, Jane. And if you need anything else, just give me a call." After he left, I stood in the entryway of my house, holding my new keys and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but satisfaction. The deep, quiet satisfaction of finally taking action instead of just enduring whatever life threw at me. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, suitcase in hand, her face streaked with tears. "I hope you're happy," she said. "I hope this was worth destroying your family." "I didn't destroy anything, Sarah. I just stopped letting you destroy me." She came down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate and angry. "You think you've won something here? You think this makes you strong?" "I think it makes me honest. It makes you cruel. It makes you no better than the people you're always complaining about." I considered that, turning it over in my mind like a stone I'd found on a beach. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was cruelty in what I was doing. But there had been cruelty in what they'd done too. The slow, steady cruelty of taking me for granted and assuming I'd always be there to absorb whatever they needed to dish out. "Maybe," I said, "but at least now I'm being cruel to people who deserve it instead of to myself." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't even know who you are anymore." "I'm Jane Morrison," I said. "I'm the owner of this house, and I'm the person who's done being your doormat." She walked past me toward the front door, then turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Jane. We're not just going to disappear because you filed some papers." "I know," I said, "but you're going to have to find somewhere else to not disappear from." After they left, I walked through my house alone for the first time in almost 2 years. It felt bigger somehow, full of space and possibility that had been crowded out by other people's lives and needs and assumptions about what I owed them. I made myself dinner in my own kitchen, using ingredients from my own refrigerator, sitting at my own table without having to accommodate anyone else's preferences or schedules. It was a simple meal, just pasta and salad, but it tasted like freedom. Later, I sat in Dad's old chair and looked around the living room where I'd spent so many evenings growing up. The family photos were still there, chronicles of birthdays, and graduations and holidays when we'd all still known how to love each other without conditions. I didn't take them down. They belonged here, part of the history of this house and this family. But I also didn't let them fool me into believing that the people in those pictures still existed. People change, families change. Sometimes the only way to honor what you used to have is to acknowledge what you've become and decide whether you can live with it. I'd decided I couldn't live with being the family scapegoat anymore. Now they'd have to decide what they could live with instead. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the driveway where 3 cars had been parked that morning. By tomorrow, there would be only one set of tire tracks leading to my front door, and they would be mine. The thought should have made me sad, but instead it made me feel something I'd almost forgotten: hope. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after I'd changed the locks. I was grading papers at my kitchen table, red pen in hand, when my phone started buzzing with notifications I'd never seen before. Twitter mentions, Facebook tags, comments on posts I hadn't made. My first thought was that someone had hacked my accounts. Then I saw the headline on the Riverside community Facebook page: "Local teacher evicts own family after Christmas lockout. Neighbors weigh in." My coffee went cold as I scrolled through. Hundreds of comments, a digital storm of opinions about my personal life from people I'd known since childhood. Some supportive, some horrified, all of them discussing my family drama like it was their Sunday entertainment. The post had been shared 43 times in 2 hours. In a town of 8,000 people, that might as well have been the front page of the New York Times. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. The original post came from Jenny Martinez, a woman who lived 2 streets over and apparently had strong opinions about family loyalty. She'd written a lengthy condemnation of my actions, complete with photos she'd taken of the eviction notice on my front door, and speculation about what kind of person throws their own mother. out on the street. But the comments told a different story. Mixed in with the pearl-clutching and moral outrage were voices I hadn't expected to hear. People who'd watched my family dynamics for years, who'd noticed things I thought no one else had seen. About time someone stood up to Linda Morrison, wrote Carol Peterson, who'd worked with Mom at the library before she retired. That woman has been guilt-tripping her kids for decades. I remember when Jane was in high school, working 2 jobs to help with bills while Sarah got a new car for her birthday, posted Mark Chen, Mrs. Chen's son. This has been building for years. Jane Morrison is one of the kindest teachers my daughter ever had. If she evicted her family, they deserved it, wrote someone I didn't recognize, though apparently their daughter had been in my sophomore English class 2 years ago. The support was unexpected and overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. This was supposed to be a private family matter, not a community referendum on 20 years of family dysfunction. My doorbell rang around 10 a.m., and I opened it to find Amy Rodriguez from the Riverside Register standing on my doorstep with a notepad and a determined expression. Ms. Morrison, I'm Amy Rodriguez from the local paper. I was wondering if you'd like to comment on the situation with your family. No comment, I said automatically, starting to close the door. Ms. Morrison, there are a lot of people talking about this on social media. Some of the comments are pretty harsh. Don't you think your side of the story deserves to be heard? I paused with my hand on the door. Amy was young, probably fresh out of journalism school, with the kind of earnest energy that reminded me of my students when they were passionate about a project. What kind of comments? She consulted her notepad. Well, there's a lot of debate about family obligations and whether adult children owe their parents housing. Some people are calling you heartless, but others are sharing their own stories. About toxic family dynamics. It's actually generating a pretty interesting conversation about boundaries and self-care. Self-care. I almost laughed. Only in 2024 would evicting your family be framed as a wellness initiative. I'm not interested in being the poster child for family dysfunction, I said. But you already are, Amy replied gently. Like it or not, your story is out there. The question is whether you want to let other people control the narrative. She had a point. Jenny Martinez's version of events painted me as a selfish daughter who'd abandoned her family over a petty disagreement. The truth was more complicated, messier, and probably wouldn't fit neatly into anyone's moral framework. If I were to comment, I said carefully, what would you want to know? The basics. How long were they living in your house? Were they paying rent? What led to the eviction? People are filling in the blanks with speculation, and some of it's pretty wild. I invited her in for coffee, and over the next hour, I told her the story. Not all of it, not the most painful parts, but enough to provide context for what had happened. I talked about the 8 months in my apartment, the bills I'd been paying, the gradual realization that I'd become the family ATM rather than a valued family member. I didn't mention Christmas Eve specifically, didn't want to give them more ammunition for their narrative that I was being dramatic. But I did talk about feeling invisible, about making sacrifices that went unacknowledged, about the slow erosion of my sense of self-worth. Amy took notes furiously, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed she understood the complexity of the situation. One more question, she said as she packed up her notepad. Do you regret it? If you could go back and handle things differently, would you? I thought about that for a long moment, staring out my window at the snowy street where I'd grown up, where everyone now knew my business and had opinions about my choices. No, I said finally. I regret that it came to this, but I don't regret standing up for myself. I should have done it years ago. The article came out online that afternoon and in print the next morning. Amy had done a fair job, presenting both sides without taking an obvious stance. She'd interviewed several neighbors, including Mrs. Patterson, who confirmed that my family had been living in the house while I lived elsewhere. But she'd also talked to Sarah, who'd given her own version of events that painted me as unstable and vindictive. Jane has always been jealous of our close family relationship, Sarah had said. This is her way of punishing us for not centering our lives around her needs. The article sparked another wave of social media discussion, but this time the tone was different, more nuanced, less judgmental. People started sharing their own stories about family boundary issues, about the difficulty of standing up to relatives who expected unlimited support without reciprocation. The hashtag Adi Doormats No More started trending locally, which was simultaneously embarrassing and oddly empowering. But the real surprise came 2 days later, when my story was picked up by a lifestyle blogger named Jennifer Walsh, who ran a website called Boundaries and Brunch. She'd grown up in a small Ohio town herself, and something about my situation had resonated with her. Her post, titled "The Christmas Lockout That Changed Everything," went viral in a way that the local coverage never could have. Shared thousands of times across platforms, discussed on podcasts, featured in online forums devoted to family dysfunction and recovery. Jennifer had taken the basic facts from Amy's article and woven them into a broader narrative about women who sacrifice themselves for family harmony, about the difference between being kind and being a pushover, about the courage it takes to disappoint people who've come to expect your unconditional availability. Jane Morrison did something that millions of women struggle to do, she wrote. She chose herself. In a culture that teaches women to be endlessly giving, endlessly accommodating, endlessly available for other people's needs, she drew a line and said, "Enough." That's not selfish, that's revolutionary. Revolutionary felt like a strong word for changing my own locks, but I had to admit that something about her framing resonated with me. I'd spent so many years trying to be the good daughter, the helpful sister, the family member who never caused trouble or made demands. Maybe there was something revolutionary about refusing to play that role anymore. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also validating in ways I hadn't expected. Messages poured in from strangers who'd read my story and seen echoes of their own lives. Women who'd been supporting adult children who refused to launch, men who'd been bankrolling siblings who saw them as ATMs rather than people, adult children who'd been carrying their parents' financial and emotional burdens for years. "Your story gave me the courage to tell my brother he can't live in my basement anymore," wrote one woman. "I've been supporting him for 3 years while he finds himself, and I finally realized I was enabling his irresponsibility. My parents moved in with us temporarily 5 years ago and have never left," wrote another. "They don't pay rent, don't help with bills, and criticize how we raise our kids. Reading about your Christmas lockout made me realize we've been locked out of our own lives." The messages kept coming, hundreds of them, each one a variation on the same theme. Family members who'd overstepped boundaries and relatives who'd lost themselves trying to maintain peace at any cost. I started to understand that my story had touched something larger than my own family dysfunction. In a culture that worshipped family loyalty above all else, I'd done something that felt forbidden, but necessary. I'd chosen my own well-being, over keeping everyone else comfortable. But the attention also brought scrutiny I hadn't anticipated. My social media accounts were flooded with comments from strangers, some supportive, others brutal. Conservative family values websites picked up the story as an example of modern selfishness, destroying traditional family structures. Liberal wellness blogs celebrated it as a masterclass in boundary setting. Everyone had an opinion about what I should have done differently, how I could have handled it better, whether my actions were justified or extreme. The nuance of the situation was lost in the noise of strangers projecting their own family traumas onto my life. The hardest part was facing my colleagues at school. Riverside High was a small building where everyone knew everyone, and my story had become the primary topic of conversation in the teachers' lounge. Some were supportive, others distant, all of them curious about details I had no intention of sharing. Principal Davies called me into his office on Friday morning, looking uncomfortable and sympathetic in equal measure. "Jane, I want you to know that your personal life is your personal life, and the school district has no intention of getting involved in family matters. But I do want to check in and make sure you're doing okay. This level of public attention can be stressful. I'm managing, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Good. And just so you know, we've had several parents reach out to express support for you. Apparently your story has resonated with a lot of people in our community. That was a relief. I'd been worried that parents would see me as unstable or inappropriate, someone who shouldn't be trusted with their children's education. Instead, it seemed like many of them saw me as someone who'd finally stood up for herself after years of being taken advantage of. The weekend brought a new development I hadn't seen coming. Tom, Sarah's husband, showed up at my door Saturday morning looking haggard and desperate. "Jane, we need to talk." I let him in, curious about what he could possibly have to say that Sarah couldn't say herself. "Look, I know you're angry and I get it. What happened on Christmas Eve was messed up, and Sarah knows that now. We all know that." "Do you?" "Yes, absolutely. And we want to make it right. We want to pay you back for all the money you've spent on the house, and we want to work out a rental agreement that's fair to everyone." I studied his face, looking for sincerity and finding mostly desperation. Tom had always been the reasonable one in their relationship, the peacemaker who tried to smooth over Sarah's more dramatic tendencies. But he also had the most to lose if they couldn't find stable housing quickly. "Tom, where have you been living? This week?" "Sarah's friend Lisa has a pull-out couch, but it's not a long-term solution. Tyler's sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor, and he doesn't understand why we can't just go home." The guilt hit like a physical blow. Tyler, confused and displaced because of choices the adults in his life had made. A 5-year-old who just wanted to sleep in his own bed and couldn't understand why his aunt had suddenly become the villain in his story. "I'm sorry Tyler's caught in the middle of this," I said. "But that's not my fault, Tom. You and Sarah chose to raise him in a house that didn't belong to you without securing your housing situation." "You're right. You're absolutely right. But he's 5, Jane. He doesn't understand why his life got turned upside down. And whose job is it to explain that to him? Whose job is it to make sure he has stable housing?" Tom ran his hands through his hair, looking exhausted. "Ours. I know that. But we're trying to figure it out, and everything happened so fast. The eviction, the media attention, the whole town talking about us like we're deadbeats." "Are you deadbeats, Tom? Because from where I'm sitting, you've been living rent-free in my house for over a year while I struggled to pay my own rent. We didn't know you were struggling. If we'd known, you would have what? Offered to help? Asked how I was doing? Acknowledged that the situation was unfair? Yes, maybe. I don't know." His honesty was refreshing, even if it wasn't particularly comforting. "Tom, what do you want from me?" "Time. Just give us more time to find a place and get our finances in order. And maybe consider letting us come back temporarily while we look for something permanent." I almost laughed. "You want me to let you move back in?" "Just temporarily. A month, maybe 2. We'll pay rent, we'll help with bills, we'll respect your space. It would give us time to find something appropriate for Tyler, somewhere with good schools and a stable environment." "And what happens when the 2 months are up and you still haven't found anything? What happens when Tyler's settled and you don't want to disrupt his life again?" Tom didn't have an answer for that, which was answer enough. "I'm sorry, Tom. I really am. But you can't move back in. That ship has sailed." He left looking defeated, and I spent the rest of the day feeling like the villain in a children's book. The mean aunt who threw the family out into the cold because she was too selfish to share her house. But that evening, I got a message that changed my perspective entirely. It was from my cousin Rachel, Dad's niece, who lived in California and had been following the story online. "Jane, I've been reading about everything that's happening, and I wanted you to know that Uncle Frank would be so proud of you. He used to worry that you let people walk all over you, that you'd never learn to stand up for yourself. He loved your generous heart, but he also wanted you to love yourself enough to protect it. She went on to share memories I'd forgotten, conversations Dad had had with her about his concerns for my future, his hope that someday I'd find the strength to set boundaries with people who took advantage of my kindness. He left you that house because he wanted you to have security and independence, Rachel wrote, not so you could be the family bank forever. Reading her message, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt and doubt that had been gnawing at me since Tom's visit began to fade, replaced by a quiet certainty that I was doing what Dad would have wanted me to do. He'd raised me to be kind, but he'd also tried to teach me to be strong. It had just taken me 32 years to figure out how to be both at the same time. Sunday morning brought another surprise. A phone call from a producer at a regional morning show who wanted to interview me about my story and its viral impact. "We're not looking for sensationalism," she assured me. "We want to have a thoughtful conversation about family boundaries and what it means to choose yourself over keeping the peace." I almost said no. The last thing I needed was more public attention, more strangers dissecting my personal life and offering unsolicited advice about how I should handle my family. But then I thought about all the messages I'd received, all the people who'd said my story had helped them see their own situations more clearly. Maybe there was value in speaking publicly about something so many people struggled with privately. "What would you want to discuss?" I asked. "The psychology of family dysfunction, the difference between helping and enabling, how to set boundaries without guilt. We'd also love to hear about what you've learned about yourself through this process." I agreed to a phone interview for the following Tuesday, with the understanding that I wouldn't discuss specific details about my family members or give them more ammunition for their narrative that I was trying to destroy them publicly. That night, I sat in my living room, in my house, on my couch, and reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. I'd gone from being a quietly struggling teacher to an accidental poster child for family boundary setting. My personal business was now public knowledge, my choices were being debated by strangers on the internet, and my nephew was sleeping on someone's floor because of decisions I'd made. It should have felt terrible. In many ways, it did feel terrible. But it also felt honest in a way my life hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Dad died, I was living authentically as myself rather than as the version of myself that kept everyone else comfortable. It was messy and complicated and painful, but it was real. And maybe, I thought as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my own bedroom in my own house, real was better than comfortable. Even if real meant being the villain in other people's stories, at least I was finally the hero in my own. The phone interview aired on a Wednesday morning in February, exactly 6 weeks after Christmas Eve. I listened to it from my kitchen while grading midterm essays, my own voice sounding strange and confident as I discussed family dynamics and boundary setting with someone I'd never met. The hardest part, I heard myself saying, wasn't standing up to them. It was accepting that loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of their comfort. The host, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in lifestyle and wellness topics, had been surprisingly insightful in her questions. She'd pushed me to articulate things I'd never put into words before, to examine the patterns that had led to Christmas Eve and everything that followed. What would you say to someone who's in a similar situation but afraid to set boundaries because they don't want to hurt their family? My recorded voice answered with certainty that surprised me. I'd ask them whose feelings they're protecting and whose they're ignoring. If you're constantly worried about hurting other people's feelings, who's worried about hurting yours? The interview generated another wave of responses, but this time they felt different, more personal, more raw. People sharing stories they'd never told before about family members who'd exploited their kindness, about the guilt and shame that came with finally saying no. A woman named Carol from Tennessee wrote about her adult son who'd been living in her basement for 8 years, contributing nothing while she supported his lifestyle on her retirement income. I kept thinking if I just loved him enough, he'd change. Your story made me realize I wasn't helping him by enabling him. A man from Oregon shared his story about his sister who'd borrowed money for emergencies that were really vacations and shopping sprees. I finally told her the bank of Big Brother was closed. She hasn't spoken to me in 6 months, but I'm not broke anymore. Each message reinforced something I was slowly learning. I wasn't the only person who'd confused kindness with doormat behavior. There was a whole invisible community of people who'd been quietly sacrificing themselves to maintain family peace, who'd been taught that saying no was selfish and setting boundaries was cruel. The most powerful message came from a therapist in Michigan who'd been working with families for 20 years. "What you did," she wrote, "is what I spend months trying to help my clients achieve. You recognize that you can't love someone into treating you better, and you chose your own well-being over their comfort. That's not selfish, that's healthy." Healthy. It was such a simple word, but it felt revolutionary when applied to my choices. For so long, I'd thought of health in terms of not causing problems, not making waves, not disappointing anyone. The idea that health might mean disappointing people who had unrealistic expectations was a paradigm shift I was still processing. But the real test of that shift came in March, when Sarah finally reached out directly. I was working in my garden, the first warm Saturday of spring, when she pulled into my driveway. I watched through the kitchen window as she sat in her car for several minutes, probably gathering courage or rehearsing what she planned to say. When she finally knocked, I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since the day I changed the locks, hadn't exchanged a word beyond what was necessary for legal proceedings. But curiosity won out over caution. She looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than simple exhaustion. Her hair was shorter, styled differently, and she was wearing clothes I didn't recognize. 3 months of upheaval had changed her as much as it had changed me. "Hi, Jane." "Sarah." We stood there for a moment, sisters who'd become strangers, each waiting for the other to make the first move. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and let her into the house that had been our childhood home, watching her take in the changes I'd made. New curtains in the living room, family photos rearranged to include more pictures of Dad, the subtle ways I'd reclaimed the space as my own. "It looks good," she said, and I could hear the effort it took to keep resentment out of her voice. "Thank you. How's Tyler?" "He's adjusting. We found a house in Millfield, about 20 minutes away. It's smaller than what we're used to, but it's ours. Tom got a promotion at work, and I'm doing bookkeeping for 3 small businesses now." Millfield was a smaller town, less expensive, with a different school district. Everything Tyler had known had changed because of choices the adults in his life had made, including me. "I'm glad you found something that works." Sarah sat down on the couch, in the spot where Mom used to hold court during family gatherings. "Jane, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." I waited, curious about what had brought her here after months of silence and legal maneuvering. "You were right." The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. "About what?" "About all of it. About us taking advantage of you. About the way we treated you. About Christmas Eve. You were right, and I was wrong. And I've spent 3 months trying to find a way to say that without admitting how terrible I've been." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. "Sarah? No, let me finish. I need to say this." She took a shaky breath. "When you moved out, I was relieved. Not because I wanted you gone, but because it meant I didn't have to think about whether what we were doing was fair. It was easier to have you live somewhere else and pay for everything than to acknowledge that we were using you." Her honesty was brutal and necessary. Christmas Eve wasn't about Tyler or family time or any of the excuses I made. It was about control. We'd gotten used to having the house to ourselves, to making decisions without considering your feelings. And when you showed up that night, it felt like an intrusion. In my own mind, I'd turned you into a guest in your own home. I sat down across from her, processing words I'd never expected to hear. When Tom lost his job last year, we should have moved out then. We should have found our own place and figured out our own situation. Instead, we decided it was easier to keep living off your generosity while pretending it was temporary. Why are you telling me this now? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because these 3 months have been hell, Jane. Not just the practical stuff, though, that's been hard enough. But the guilt, the shame, the knowledge that I destroyed our relationship because I was too selfish and entitled to see what I was doing to you. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture I remembered from childhood. And because I saw the interview you did. When you talked about protecting other people's feelings while ignoring your own, I realized that's exactly what I'd trained you to do. I'd trained you to prioritize my comfort over your own well-being, and then I got angry when you finally stopped. The acknowledgement felt like a gift I'd stopped hoping for. I also realized something else, she continued. I don't know who you are anymore. I know who you were when you were taking care of everyone else, but I don't know who you are when you're taking care of yourself. And I'd like to, if you're willing to let me try. I studied her face, looking for manipulation or calculation, and finding only exhaustion and sincerity. What does that look like, Sarah? You getting to know me? I don't know. Maybe we could have coffee sometimes. Maybe I could listen when you talk instead of just waiting for my turn to speak. Maybe I could ask how you're doing and actually care about the answer. It was such a simple concept, yet so revolutionary in the context of our relationship. I can't promise I'll be good at it right away, she said. I've spent so long thinking of you as the person who fixes things and pays for things that I'll probably slip back into old patterns sometimes, but I want to try. I thought about the woman who'd locked me out on Christmas Eve, who'd called me dramatic for standing up for myself, who'd painted me as the villain in every conversation about our family's dysfunction. Then I looked at the woman sitting across from me now, admitting fault and asking for a chance to do better. People could change. It was rare, and it required genuine recognition of harm done, but it was possible. I'd like that, I said. But things can't go back to the way they were, Sarah. I won't go back to being the family ATM or the person everyone calls when they need something fixed. I know, I wouldn't want you to. And if you slip back into old patterns, I'm going to call you on it. I'm not going to quietly accept disrespect anymore because it's easier than confronting it. I understand. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating the wreckage of our relationship and trying to find solid ground for something new. It wasn't a magical reconciliation or a return to the sisterhood we'd had as children, but it was honest in a way we'd never been before. When she left, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in years, I felt seen by someone who'd known me my entire life. The relationship with Mom proved more complicated. She'd found her own apartment in Riverside, a small one-bedroom place near the senior center where she'd started volunteering. We spoke occasionally, brief conversations about practical matters that carefully avoided anything emotional or contentious. She never apologized for Christmas Eve, never acknowledged her role in the family dysfunction that had led to my breaking point. But she also stopped asking for money and stopped expecting me to manage her problems for her. It was progress, even if it wasn't reconciliation. Mike remained distant, polite but wounded in a way that seemed permanent. He'd moved in with friends in Columbus and found work at a construction company, building a life that didn't include regular family contact. I missed the brother I'd grown up with, but I understood that some relationships couldn't survive the truth about what they'd really been. The most unexpected development came in April, when I was contacted by a woman named Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who ran a nonprofit organization focused on family boundary education. "I've been following your story," she said during our phone conversation, "and I think you'd be perfect for something we're developing." The organization was launching a series of workshops for people struggling with family boundary issues, and they wanted to hire me as a facilitator. The irony wasn't lost on me, the woman who'd spent most of her life as a doormat being asked to teach other people how to stand up for themselves. What would it involve? Leading small group discussions, sharing your experience when appropriate, helping people develop practical strategies for setting boundaries with family members. The pay isn't huge, but it would be meaningful work. I thought about all the messages I'd received. All the people who'd said my story had helped them see their own situations more clearly. Maybe there was a way to turn my personal disaster into something that could help others avoid similar pain. I'm interested. The training was intensive, 6 weeks of workshops on family systems, codependency, communication strategies, and trauma-informed facilitation. I learned the clinical terms for patterns I'd lived with for years, discovered that my experience wasn't unique or abnormal, but part of a well-documented phenomenon. Enmeshed families, Dr. Walsh explained during one session, don't recognize individual boundaries. Everyone's problems become everyone's problems, and family members lose their sense of individual identity. Breaking free from that system requires incredible courage, because it means disappointing people who've become dependent on your lack of boundaries. The first workshop I facilitated was terrifying and exhilarating. 8 people sitting in a circle, sharing stories that echoed my own in ways that were both heartbreaking and validating. A mother whose adult daughter expected free childcare while treating her like hired help. A man whose brother had been borrowing money for 15 years without ever paying it back. A woman whose parents had moved in temporarily and were still there 5 years later. "The hardest part," said Maria, a nurse whose family treated her like their personal emergency fund, "is that when you finally say no, they act like you're the one being unreasonable." "That's called gaslighting," I explained, using terms I'd learned in training. When someone makes you feel crazy for having normal boundaries, they're trying to maintain a system that benefits them at your expense. Each workshop taught me as much as it taught the participants. I saw my own patterns reflected in their stories, my own growth mirrored in their tentative attempts to prioritize their own well-being. By summer, I was facilitating 2 workshops a month in addition to my teaching responsibilities. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying in ways I'd never experienced. Instead of giving endless pieces of myself to people who took me for granted, I was using my experience to help others reclaim their own lives. The anniversary of Christmas Eve approached with surprising calm. Instead of dreading the holidays, I found myself planning a celebration that reflected who I'd become, rather than who I'd been expected to be. I invited Mrs. Chen and 3 colleagues from school for Christmas Eve dinner. People who valued my company rather than my utility, who asked about my well-being and listened to the answers. We cooked together, shared stories, played board games that went on too long, and laughed until our sides hurt. It wasn't the Christmas of my childhood, but it was authentic in a way those holidays had never been. Sarah called that evening, a brief conversation to check in and wish me well. We were still learning how to be sisters without the toxic patterns that had defined our relationship for so long, but we were learning. "I hope you're having a good Christmas," she said. "I am. A really good one." "I'm glad, Jane. You deserve that." After my guests left, I sat in Dad's chair with a cup of tea and thought about the year that had passed. 12 months ago, I'd been standing in the snow outside my own front door, hurt and confused, and still believing that love meant accepting whatever treatment people chose to give me. Now I was sitting in my own living room, in my own house, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd built on my own terms. The workshops I facilitated, the boundaries I'd learned to maintain, the relationships I'd cultivated based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. I thought about all the people who'd reached out to share their own stories, who'd found courage in my willingness to disappoint family members who'd taken me for granted. The ripple effects of standing up for myself had reached further than I'd ever imagined. On my refrigerator was a card from Carol in Tennessee, whose basement-dwelling son had finally moved out after she implemented the strategies we'd discussed in the workshops. "You saved my retirement," she'd written, "and probably my sanity, too." Next to it was a photo Tyler had drawn for me, a picture of 2 houses with stick figures waving from the windows. Aunt Jane's house and our house. He'd labeled it in our careful kindergarten writing. Below that, in Sarah's handwriting, "He's learning that people can love each other even when they don't live in the same place." The innocence of that statement, the simple acceptance that love didn't require sharing, space or resources, felt like wisdom I'd spent 32 years learning. I thought about Dad, about the conversation we'd never had but that I finally understood. He'd left me the house not as a burden, but as a foundation. A place where I could build a life that reflected my own values rather than other people's expectations. It had taken me 2 years to understand what he'd really given me. Permission to put myself first, to choose my own well-being over keeping everyone else comfortable, to love people without losing myself in the process. The house was quiet around me, peaceful in a way it had never been when it was full of other people's needs and demands and assumptions about my availability. This was what contentment felt like, I realized. Not happiness exactly, but the deep satisfaction of living authentically, of making choices based on my own values rather than other people's convenience. I'd become the woman Dad had hoped I'd be. Kind but not naive, generous but not depleted, loving but not lost. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel in California. "Saw your Christmas Eve post on social media. Uncle Frank would be so proud of the woman you've become." I smiled, thinking about the man who'd taught me to be strong, even though it had taken me years to figure out what strength actually looked like. Strength wasn't keeping everyone happy at my own expense. Strength was disappointing people who expected me to set myself on fire to keep them warm. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my own bedroom in my own house, I thought about the workshops I'd be facilitating in the new year, the people who were still learning what I'd learned through necessity and pain. Tomorrow, I'd help someone else take their first tentative steps toward choosing themselves over keeping the peace. The woman who'd been locked out on Christmas Eve was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love without respect was just manipulation dressed up in prettier clothes. Someone who knew that family was supposed to be a source of support, not a drain on resources and emotional energy. Someone who'd learned that the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is refuse, to sacrifice herself on the altar of other people's comfort. I'd gone from doormat to advocate, from victim to facilitator, from the family ATM to someone who helped others close their own banks of endless giving. It wasn't the transformation I'd planned, but it was the one I'd needed. And as I drifted, off to sleep in my own bed, in my own room, in my own house, I felt something I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. The quiet satisfaction of being exactly who I was meant to be. The Christmas lockout had been the end of one story and the beginning of another. A story where I was the hero instead of the victim, where boundaries were acts of love rather than selfishness, where saying no was a complete sentence that didn't require justification or apology. It was a better story, and it was finally authentically mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.